Our guest this week is Oliver Jones. He's the co-founder and chief executive of Chayora, an international infrastructure investor, developer, and operator of major data center campuses in China. Chayora is developing large, fully licensed data center sites in key cities across China, initially in Tianjin, Shanghai, Hangzhou, and Nanjing. Oliver, welcome to the show.
James, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hey, so I invited Oliver in because I've known Oliver since 2012. He met me when I was at eBay. He came in with this crazy idea about building data centers in China in 2012, and he has persisted. And this year they are opening, because I will tell you, we're going to get into some of this conversation, but anybody who's tried to do business in China, it's a totally different world. It's a different environment and very difficult. And it's very impressive to have a major implementation like this be successful. So congrats to you, Oliver.
That's very kind, Dean. It's 8 years sounds like a hell of a long time, and it didn't feel as long as that as we were going along the journey. But it is a tough environment, as you say. But as we'll probably talk about a little bit later on, it's a market that's worth focusing upon for a host of reasons. And sometimes the more difficult things in life are the most valuable ones to go for.
A little bit more background on Oliver. Oliver joined the board of iMasons. He was the third board member in 2016. So just probably 4 or 5 months after we started, he came in and helped us build this organization. I have a lot of respect for Oliver. He's done some amazing things, and he's got great insights. He and I did a trip to Tianjin to see his data center and also go to the school there, looking at scholarships as we expand for iMasons. And I really want to dig into AI and just China's perspective, because Oliver, you introduced me to the book AI Superpowers, and
yes,
the China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order by Dr. Kai-Fu Lee. That was amazing. Can we just get from you a perspective of what AI means in China?
Sure. The Kai-Fu Lee book is, I think, an incredible read, as you say, not just for the insight it provides on the more recent years of China versus America, which many people will find surprising, but also his personal journey, which is a fascinating one as well. So no, agreed, and it's definitely a book worth picking up upon. But to your point on AI in China, one of the things China has set out in its national strategic plan, and you'll be aware that China runs on a series of 5-year plans very effectively, is that it's set a goal by 2030 to be the world's leading economy in respect of AI. And that's a big statement to make for an organization, for a country like China. China has, over the last 30 to 40 years, has set a whole series of seemingly impossible goals relating to public infrastructure, cities, airports, and GDP growth, and has an incredible capability through being, if you like, the world's largest organization, with 1.4 billion people in some way playing a part, to be able to achieve many of those goals against surprising challenges along the way. So when they say that it's their goal to achieve it, they will do a very good job of getting very close, and I would bet that they will achieve that. So how are they doing it? They are both committing at a public level to supporting the development of AI in a number of cities around the country, one of which is Tianjin, Dean, where you and I went and where our data center is based. As a point of reference, Tianjin government in the middle of 2018, so about a year and a half ago, announced it was committing around $16 billion as a government to support research and development into AI and machine learning.
16 billion.
16 billion is a big number, and
Wow.
It's a big number, particularly where you compare, as the South China Morning Post did at the time, to the amount committed by all of the 28 governments of the European Union, so including Germany, France, UK, who collectively had committed just under $2 billion, so 1/8 of what one city, one province in China was committing. Now, what China has been focused upon is that in AI terms, it's perhaps most renowned for the extent to which it's using AI in the healthcare space, to start analyzing and looking for deviations and anomalies in the human genome and spotting issues there. Come back to that in respect of the coronavirus, for example, quite shortly. Mm-hmm. The second aspect is it's been very well closely associated with face recognition systems and security. And the West and China have different views on, the appropriateness of that, but both are valid views in my opinion. And the third is that in respect of autonomous vehicles, where China has been pushing very hard to see how autonomous vehicles can help it in respect of traffic control, in respect of reducing accidents and a whole host of other elements. So Baidu, the Chinese very large cloud player, who was leading much of the research in respect of autonomous vehicles, made available its testing and training and platformware to the whole market in order to assist the country in moving forward. So that brings full circle perhaps around to how does the government achieve this goal? Well, what the government does is it creates an environment in which it is in the interest of private companies, and private companies in China represent around 50% of GDP, much as is the case in the United Kingdom, for example. And creating an environment where it is conducive to private sector companies to develop commercial applications and to help China in a kind of nationalistic way achieve its goals under the 5-year plan. And the interweaving, not in a dark way, but the interweaving and the level of communication between the public sector and the private sector is strong, and it's positive to enable all or each to achieve their respective goals. So AI is a really exciting thing, but the capacity of our data center infrastructure worldwide to deal with the step change we will see in AI over the next 5 to 10 years, and Dean, you and I have discussed this endlessly, is going to dwarf anything we've ever seen before. Just the autonomous vehicles will generate so much data that it will be a whole new chapter in both edge computing and hyperscale storage, in my opinion. So big journey ahead, and China is going to be very strongly placed on that.
They keep talking about this. I look at it as world domination. Somebody has predicted that by 2030, those who win in the AI battle will rule the world.
Yes, I think there's a lot of emotional language that's used around those type of things. I think world domination is probably out of a Western press article. China's very clear. It's about it wants to be the world leader in that field, not to the derogation of others out there. And indeed, I sincerely hope all parties involved in the current trade talks recognize that if we end up on a parallel twin tech universe where one either has to choose as a country behind backing the US or China, then the world economy is going to suffer from that. I think all parties involved, are smart enough to recognize that's an undesirable outcome. So the position in terms of the world domination piece, I think the most important factor is looking for how collaboration across the world's leading thinkers and what China is today, which is the world leading repository of data. A number of phrases have been used likening China to the Saudi oil leadership in the past, but data is now the oil of today, is the type of phraseology that one sees out there. And China has deep, deep pools of data. China's been collecting data, not for dark reasons or anything else, but simply through the fact that what China has generally done in the last 15 to 20, maybe even to 30 years, is leapfrog evolutionary steps that other countries have gone through. China was a very, very long way from where it is today in the late 1970s when Chairman Mao passed. And in going straight to mobile devices, it enabled organizations like Alibaba through Alipay or WeChat Pay through Tencent to adopt e-commerce very early on. And Kai-Fu Lee's book is quite instrumental in setting out this evolutionary era. It was a period between 2013 and 2015 where there was a step change in the, if you like, the gradual evaporation of cash from the Chinese economy. Everything you buy in China today is bought through a QR code, and you flash up your Alipay wallet or your WeChat Pay wallet or whichever it may be, where you do have beggars that you encounter on the streets, and they're remarkably few actually for the size of the country. They often only take QR codes. They don't take cash either, which I think is a fascinating observation on life today.
Just I want people to hear that. Make sure they hear that. Somebody on the street that's asking for money has a QR code.
Well, they're very adaptable. They often have 3 QR codes because they don't want. So if you only use Alipay and they've got a WeChat Pay QR code, they may miss out on the donation. So these guys, you'll tend to see that they'll have 2 or 3 that are just around their neck, or they hold it up, and enabling people to tap and go and move on, and the world's a better place. It's an interesting facet. But going back to the point on data, what that's meant is that over the last 5 to 6 to 7 years, since the early 2010s, the Chinese population has become very comfortable with using their sort of remote cashless payment systems.
Yeah.
What that's allowed is that those that offer services, whether it's food delivery services or car rental services or train travel or air travel, to build up profiles of what people want. The downside of that in the West, people who say they suddenly woke up when Cambridge Analytica suddenly worked out that, oh my God, Facebook's going to use some of our data. Well, come on. It's remarkable that people didn't have that perspective. And so long as the data is used as we overtly are doing in the 5G world, which is to say, by knowing more about you, we can give you what you want. China's been doing that for the last few years extensively. So they have very significant data as a collective, buying skills, the market's requirements, the ability to enter new markets for entrepreneurial companies in China is extraordinarily high, better than probably most other countries in the world, because there is this enthusiasm by the millennials in China to be part of the digital revolution that China has been going through and to have their piece of it. And the Chinese economy is about supporting that. There are more, it's claimed, private equity firms backing startups in Shenzhen than there are in Silicon Valley. And that's an interesting perspective on that front, and certainly more money being thrown at them.
One of the things that strikes me is the last 50 years of global politics has been dominated by the memes, if you will, or the dominant systems of capitalism and what we consider communism or socialism. But what strikes me is that what's happening in China right now is something entirely new. It's an entirely different type of hybrid system, the likes of which the world has never seen before in terms of scale. And I'm sure you saw that the big news this week was that the Chinese are building 2 hospitals in less than a month, I think.
Well, in 6 days, actually, I think is the from breaking ground to turning on the lights.
It's insane.
Which is insane. It is insane, but actually, the Chinese have proven very good at that. But I've worked with the British military and the American military, and when you deploy compounds in locations like Afghanistan, or you put up setups, and they built hospitals in Helmand province, which were exactly the same as we've seen going up in China, which are containerized, shipped, equipped, ready to be bolted together and turned on once you connect the power. I wouldn't be in a position to comment on whether they'd achieved it in 6 days or not for various reasons, but actually rapid build through prefabrication is available to everyone in the world. What the Chinese authorities, I think, are demonstrating, I think for good reason, but also for good visibility, for good optics, is that this is a country where the government is taking the situation that it's facing at the moment very seriously indeed. And that means that they are doing whatever they can do to try to put things in place. So, but you're right, James, the ability to create things very fast is notable. And, we see that in infrastructure terms and in construction terms, because to very good world-class standards of construction, you can move often a little faster than you can in some other countries around the world, once you've got all the preparatory work in place. And that's the permits and the certification and the regulatory requirements, where China has its requirements as any country, district, town, city has as well.
So there was something in the book that Dr. Lee was talking about that really struck me. In 2019, I believe it was, they had the AI conference scheduled. They had to move it because it was falling on Chinese New Year. This is the first time that they had more than 50% of the submission of those papers from China. If you go back 3 years, it was non-existent. And so you think about these massive buildings like that 1,000-bed hospital that's able to turn up in 6 days or less. They did the same thing with AI and the development of this and the investment, like you said, $17 billion or $16 billion, really the country focusing on something. And the movement and the innovations and the advancements that are happening, China's just so different, so uniquely positioned because of the data they have, as you mentioned, and the ability for the government to actually focus the country on doing something at country scale.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I often use the term, we talk in the West about hyperscale, but when you go to China, you need to up that a bit, and we talk about China scale over there. Yes, the characteristics that you talk about there in terms of the government really pushing for it, the achievements that are being demonstrated in terms of things like, for example, facial recognition. The target for this year is for 90% of people captured on facial recognition to be matched to the national database of over 1.3 billion of the 1.4 billion people within 3 seconds is likely to be achieved. Now, think of the search and the analytical capability to be able to dissect from a snapshot of a moving person to a fixed ID photograph that may be up to a number of years old, and that's pretty extraordinary stuff. When you start applying that to the, spotting anomalies in the DNA structure and the genome structures, and I mentioned a little bit earlier, I thought a really good illustration around the big challenges we're seeing with the coronavirus at the present stage is that it was said that the ability of the Chinese researchers to be able to identify the genomic string that would allow other researchers to start focusing on a vaccine for the new virus was achieved within 5 days, whereas under the SARS virus a number of years ago, 15 or so years ago, that took 6 months.
Wow.
Now, we've moved a long way forward, but what would typically have happened in the past, and I think that, when you start looking at a global health crisis at the present stage, even though the numbers are relatively small in terms of those affected and those who've died to date, is a really good illustration of how when governments can collaborate and the Chinese research is being fed out to the Western pharmaceutical firms and academic institutions, university research departments, different parts of the world are coming up with bits of the jigsaw extraordinarily fast. And one hopes that, therefore, the understanding of the nature of the virus and its various mutations, along with the means of being able to treat that so that we can address a health crisis in a much shorter period than has been the case in the past, is very much upon us today. And so this, I hope, notwithstanding that I hope that the situation passes sooner rather than less soon, this does, I hope, demonstrate the importance of being able to use Chinese brains and international brains to solve the human challenges that are out there. And it'll help, not hinder, the trade agreements that will be going on in parallel.
Oliver, I just had a quick question around the standardization specifically to your business. Last week on Bloomberg, during the World Economic Forum, the chairman of Cisco had mentioned that they've struggled to get business in China. They've been in China for 30 years, but because of the standardization there and the interoperability back into the rest of the world, they were struggling to gain traction there. So just wondering if you had any insight into that specifically.
Well, I don't have insight into the Cisco position specifically, but the observation in overall terms I do, and I have some quite strong views on that. I've worked in different businesses in challenging new markets and emerging markets around the world in many instances over the years. And the challenges of working within China are really different. I find China a much easier market, for example, than India to operate within, because there's greater clarity and it's a process that's got to be understood. But if you follow the process, you can achieve the end outcomes. Many international companies have found it challenging because there has been an uneven playing field in respect of the accessibility offered to the likes of Ali and Tencent into, say, the US market against their equivalents into the Chinese market. And that is at the heart, I understand, of the phase 2 or stage 2 trade talks that's taking place, because there does need to be a degree of balancing taking place there. But it's also true that many internationals, and whether Americans or Brits or French or whatever it is, very often will drop into a market, a big, important market like China, with what I can only call a rather arrogant approach, which is that we know how it should be done. And if we raise our voices and shout loud enough, then it will happen like it happens in every country in the world. And if you're going into a small and relatively non-powerful, maybe sub-Saharan African nation, rightly or wrongly, that might work. But actually, what we're seeing is the evolution of China to being from standing nowhere to standing second in the global GDP tables, and projections that suggest that the US and China will be, the dominant forces in the world. I think there's probably parallels between, maybe how the UK had to get used to the US being a more powerful global player, and maybe in some fields, the US has got to accept that it isn't going to be necessarily number one in all fields. And so I think that there is a need, and the most skilled of the international businesses, and there are many, are building significant indigenous, locally built operating structures for super senior and successful people who do deeply understand the market. Now, I know Cisco will have certainly been in that category, but assuming a solution that works for you on the streets of Belgium and Netherlands and France, for example, is going to simply be capable of being delivered in Shanghai and Beijing, is perhaps short-sighted. And why should you change? Well, China's got a population of 1.4 billion people, and I've used this frequently as a means of understanding, because you throw a number like 1.4 billion out, and to be honest, no one can really relate to that. But if we think of China as a single market, it's ludicrous. 1.4 billion people is equivalent to the population of North America, i.e. Canada, USA, and Mexico, plus all 28 countries of the European Union, plus all former countries of the USSR plus 10%. Now, and think for a moment about how many discrete markets we have in the US alone.
Mm-hmm.
So to address China as, China is good or bad, or it's accessible or inaccessible, is a little bit like mixing up, Plano, Texas with, the outskirts of Brussels. They're different markets with different solutions required. I make the point about China scale before. One of the things, and I've been going to China now for just over 30 years. I first went in 1988, and it doesn't mean I know a great deal about China, but I probably know, a reasonable amount about it over that period. But I keep coming back to one truism, and that is that China is really, really big. And it's an observation that I'm stealing from others who've coined that quote in the past. But actually, that's a real big issue, literally, to get one's head around. Because addressing for example, within around 200 miles of Shanghai, there's 200 million people. That's more than half the US population. And so to even think of Shanghai as one market is perhaps a little superficial. So what we collectively have to be able to do is recognize that in market opportunity terms, more than 20% of the world's online population, it would be perhaps foolhardy to have a strategy for any size corporation that emits that amount of people. Now, not everyone's going to be successful, but you don't need to have a 40% market share in China in order to have a very big business. You might achieve the same with a 5 or 6 or 7%. And, Microsoft talks publicly about, its market share in China is in low single figures. And in itself, for an organization like Microsoft, that's a journey that they're moving on. But for many other organizations, having a single figure market share in China would make them a very large market cap entity should they go into the public markets.
Yeah, and Oliver, I want to support what you said, because I remember when I was at eBay, I heard the stories about eBay going into China, and Meg Whitman even talked about this publicly, where they had that same, lack of a better word, arrogance, American arrogance, to come in and say, all right, we're going to run our business and do it this way in China, and it just failed. And there's one main thing that you have to accept when you go into China. You have to partner, right? You must partner with companies over there and align with the government. That's the only way you can be successful. And I go back to Dr. Lee's book. What he talked about in the difference of the way they compete is gladiator style, right?
Yes, that's true. The partnering piece is, I think, probably good practice to ensure, whether through formal legal partnerships or collaborative alliances, and certainly alignment to government policy. I mean, good news in China is that it's written down. The 5-year plan is the 5-year plan. And if an organization goes in to try to do something that's misaligned with the 5-year plan, they're going to find it much harder than to be aligned. So on the partnering side, actually what one sees is with some other countries where going in to develop major project, the Koreans back in the day in the Middle East around their steel work would be very insular in how they engage with local personnel. And to a certain extent, the Chinese, in respect of some of the infrastructure projects in Africa, have done the opposite of what I think is the ideal, which is, we want to be in a position, and I'll speak for Chayora here, where we want to ensure that world-class standards and international practices and all of the transparency that our customers expect is taken as read. But we also want to ensure, because you can't run any international operation with expatriate staff. It's not commercially viable in the long term, and it's not very sensible. What we need to ensure is that we ourselves recruit great expert local Chinese resources, and we enable our customers to access the same. And Dean, if you recall, when we went to the Tianjin Vocational Institute, which is a university of some 18,000 students doing undergraduate and postgraduate and diploma studies, it was extraordinary to find that the big data and telecommunications faculty comprised some 2,000 pupils there. Now, we met some extraordinarily twinkly-eyed, awake, interested, motivated individuals when we did that session there, didn't we? And ensuring that we and others can get access to good local hires is a really, really important element, and something that obviously aligns what we as Chayora are doing in China with what we as infrastructure masons are seeking to do on an international basis in terms of, helping smart young people make their way in our industry.
I also found a very interesting observation there too, which was I walked into the different classes. One was a networking class specifically, and it was 90% female in the networking class. And then in the presentation that I gave, it was more than 50% female in the room. And they'd packed this room, right? Overpacked it.
It was super impressive, actually. There were about 500, 600 people in there, and they hung on every word. And actually, most didn't require the translation that was provided. I think it was, again, super impressive. This is a university that is delivering high-quality technical graduates. It's not a Harvard or Yale or Oxbridge equivalent. There are those in China, of course, but this is a mainstream university producing great young people. And I have consistently been impressed with the younger generation who are in their teens and 20s that if you go for a walk in cities like Nanjing, for example, the number of kids who'll come up and say, look, can I walk with you to practice my English? Imagine walking around Central Park and, having a bunch of American kids come up and say, I'd like to practice my Mandarin to, some of the Chinese visitors to the city or whatever it may be. So I love the motivation and the drive that the youth in China has got, to succeed and be part of the journey the country is going on.
Yeah. Yeah, the work ethic is incredible. And we could talk all day about this one. There's so many different things I would love us to know. And I really want to get to Crypto Brad for a second here. So he's got a tag name here, because what's happening in China?
Well, it's interesting right now because Bitcoin has a halving coming up. So that's going to potentially put a lot of the miners out of business because the cost of actually mining will go up. So you'll probably see some consolidation, and I'm just curious, China being the largest mining country in the world by far, with Bitmain and the other providers, if you see any concerns there with the miners in China.
I don't directly at the moment, and that's as much because many of the Bitcoin mining firms, or the cryptocurrency mining firms to be more precise, out there are relatively young by definition of the fact that this is a relatively new sector, and would be parties that we would be keen potentially to get involved in our data centers once we have the investment grade anchors in place. So we've not been actively pursuing the Bitcoin sector. Having access to significant power, having access to resilient and world-class operating environments is very important, of course, to cryptocurrency creators. The question, I suppose, to my mind is that along with many other governments around the world, I'm not sure that there is yet absolute clarity in terms of would cryptocurrency be permitted or become less valuable by virtue of legislation in China in the same way as anything else, because there is a risk that do you lose control of your economy if it becomes out with the control of the government itself, a concern of the European Union and the UK and indeed the US. So we haven't seen the direct involvement to date of parties who wish to set up. Our very high rack density potential environments, though, are highly suited to cryptocurrency operations. I would anticipate that we would have customers from that sector as part of our portfolio of customers in the foreseeable future. It hasn't been one that we've engaged with directly yet, so I can give no further insight on that.
What I see here is there's a company called, I think it's Bitmain in China.
Yeah.
Some of the things that roll up there is Bitcoin miners, specifically Bitcoin, are making over $7 million a day right now.
Mm-hmm.
And there's incredible wealth creation. And as you said, it's unpredictable and which currency is going to go, but just overall crypto mining is continuing. And as China being the place where the largest amount of that happens, and by the way, these are just in outdoor buildings, there's no real data center elements of this that are our traditional type thing.
Yeah.
But it hasn't gone away. And as a matter of fact, it's just the amount of money that keeps flowing into this. I'd love to get James' perspective on this as well. Just the future of these currencies. I look at PayPal; they're accepting all types of currencies, including cryptocurrencies. And then I look at what Facebook's doing and others. Like, it's emerging. It's going to happen. It just China seems to be pretty heavy in this, and that's what we're very interested in finding out more about.
Yeah, China's position, I think, is, again, going back to the point I made a little earlier of leapfrogging certain elements, and we saw leapfrog to mobile devices as being one. Mm-hmm. One of the elements was that the China banking, the domestic banking sector, and indeed the leading international banks, a number of years ago had less robust, if you like, operating systems than perhaps the leading Western comparables in the finance sector and the like. Mm-hmm. And what has happened in China is that rather than moving to credit card use and the processing through the banks, the banks have been leapfrogged by the tech firms. And so, people are as comfortable as we were talking about earlier with WeChat Pay and Alipay and so forth, and more so than they would be in terms of traditional banking for the consumers that are out there. What is interesting, I think, is PayPal has recently, I think, secured its operating license to enable it to address and be part of the China market. Yep. And I think that's really exciting because whereas, as you'll know, Dean, from when Uber explored its future and its means of operating in China and ultimately collaborated and sold to Didi as the local operator, there have been people that will come and they'll go, and some people will find China too difficult and they'll retreat. Others will come in and maybe have one or two or three goes. And I think one looks at organizations, like the Oracles and the IBMs who have been in China and been a bit out of China and are not, to my knowledge, looking to walk away from and say, oh, well, it just didn't work. There is a persistence that's needed, and perhaps akin to our own persistence over the last few years, that sometimes you've got to keep running up a few roads before you find the way through the maze. So PayPal, I'm really interested in what's happening in China. You get back to, a small share of that big market will make a very big difference to PayPal's market cap on the international markets.
Bitmain's worth, after their last 600K chip order, they're worth $12 billion. So they're not small.
No, I mean, that's pretty amazing. But they'll be worth 100 billion probably in a very short order, I imagine.
They're losing money. This is where it's kind of interesting. This is one of the last halvings before Bitcoin, starts approaching its 21 million supply. So these algorithms become harder to solve. There's still fees generated with it, but as they become harder to solve, there's more power utilized, and there's a big concern that a lot of the smaller miners are going to go out of business if they're not operating efficiently. So if the data centers are not operating at maximum efficiency, their costs are just going to be too high. We'll see what happens when that actually occurs this year. I think it's supposed to happen around May or so. So it'll be interesting to watch that.
It seems like the technological barrier is also going to become more important, right? Because the global Bitcoin main operates at 3 transactions per second. So there's this massive backlog of unconfirmed transactions. Certainly that doesn't improve with computational complexity. I know there's several proposals to try to address this, but when you talk about adding the population of China to the mix and possibly of India to the mix, it seems unlikely that Bitcoin can handle that.
Tell you what, why don't we go back around, because I also want to know about the edge side, Huawei, right, specifically, and in China, and this whole battle between the U.S. But in China, what is happening with 5G, Oliver?
I believe in China that 5G is rapidly being deployed and rolled out. It's a key part of the Smart City initiative. It's a key part of the Internet of Things. The networks in China are complex, dominated as they are by China Telecom, China Mobile, and China Unicom. But the ease with which you have coverage is exceptionally good. I never have problems with lost signals in China. You have very, very good coverage down in all of the major locations that I've gone to. And so a key part of being able to get to the goals of 2030 that we talked about before is to have networks that are going to support that. And, China's commitment through its state-owned enterprises, the ones I've mentioned, to making the investment that's required is a significant feature. We see in the data center world a preference openly expressed by CT, CU, and CM to focus their investment on network and connectivity rather than on data centers, for example. Often, whereas in the past, the largest proportion of data center capacity in China had been created by and was operated by the telcos, that's rapidly shifting. It's still a very significant and the largest single group. But actually, use of capital is as important when you're a state-owned enterprise as it is if you're a private company. The task of CTCM and CU is to make sure that China's networks enable it to prosper as a digital economy rather than a nearly digital economy. In respect of that, on the edge front, the extent to which one's able to get high-quality streaming that's associated with these, we talked about the surveillance cameras and the security cameras and the networks. All of these, if you like, are examples of edge computing taking place. When we get into electric cars and driverless cars, of course, those are probably one of the ultimate edge devices in terms of data capture. And again, as we've talked about with the autonomous vehicles things in the past, Dean, I think one of the most important elements that will come out of autonomous vehicles will be less about being able to drive around a corner without knocking a pedestrian over or a cyclist from his or her bike. It will be about capturing an absolute record of the real world in real time, which means that should things happen and should a mugger jump on an individual by the side of the street or a burglary take place or a car crash happen, actually there's many different versions of the actual video capture that will allow that to be assessed and evaluated. What that means, I think, is that whereas the automotive companies and many talking just about autonomous vehicles probably correctly comment that 99 point something % of the data captured is not needed when you've gone round the corner and you haven't knocked over the pedestrian or knocked the person off their bike. Actually, the lawyers and those who value data will seek to keep, I think, the majority of that data for a lot longer than people anticipate. So the burden and the expectations on society's use and the insurance industry's use and, if you like, the security companies' use of that data, and who knows what else one can sort of bolt onto that, will be of paramount importance. Just think, for example, about how precisely accurate our weather forecasts will be if you have a number of hundreds of millions of vehicles driving down real roads, driving precisely and understand the temperature and the precipitation and the road friction that they're working on. That type of data becomes immensely valuable.
And James, Oliver talked about being able to identify anybody in the country in 3 seconds is one of the government's focuses.
With 90% accuracy, so it's but actually that's PDG, pretty damn good, I think.
I mean, where are they today? Is it 7 seconds?
I don't know the exact today, but the target was by this year, 2020, to be able to achieve that goal. And there've been a number of examples of demonstrating how. So there's 450 million networked CCTV cameras in China. A lot of cameras. I saw an article just last week about the challenges in the City of London in the UK, where there's been considerable pushback to an increase in the number of security cameras. Rather impressively, that it's projected that with what was proposed, London would creep into the top 10 of global cities in terms of the number of cameras, the other 9 all being Chinese cities, of course. The extent to which being able to tolerate or accept culturally television cameras, generally, if you're not doing something that's underhand or wrong, probably you don't mind about what it's used for, but we all have different views on that. And, privacy has different levels of, it's a spectrum, if you like, on privacy that is, culturally more or less acceptable in different environments. So, 450 million network TV cameras is quite an achievement, frankly, and you do see them everywhere.
I don't know if you've seen this before, but there have been projects out like CV Dazzle, for example, which was spun out of the open source face detection toolkit, OpenCV. What it does is explores the use of how fashion can be used as camouflage from face detection technology. So there are certain patterns which AI finds utterly confusing and causes misclassification on a large scale. If you go to cvdazzle.com, there's a pretty good example of this. So it's pretty exotic hair, fashion, and other makeup applied to the face, and even stickers and such that results in mass confusion for face recognition technology. So I wonder if futuristic depictions of society have always had exotic hair and fashions. If you look at stuff like Hunger Games,
I was thinking the same thing.
I wonder how real that is actually going to be if all of us are walking around trying to subvert facial recognition with really exotic fashion. Because take a look at some of the images on that. It's people with multiple eyes and
right.
really really strange hairstyles, and they're actively exploring how to defeat facial recognition this way.
Hey, I mean, people are always going to, seek to make facial recognition something that's, if you like, socially acceptable. The benefits that arise under 5G and through AI have got to outweigh the perceived disbenefits, in my view. And so, if, as I love, when I now arrive in the United States, I don't have to touch anything, I don't have to do anything other than I look into the global entry scat camera, and it recognizes me and it prints out my entry card. Hey, look, I'm cool with that. I love that because it means no queues. It means it's done simply. I don't even have to have my glasses on to work out what buttons to push. And that's a good use of facial recognition there that I'm sure others are very happy with. If I did have a tendency to put stickers on my face and wear weird hairstyles and the like in order to avoid that, and as a consequence, I have to stand in the usual 1-hour queue at immigration in the US, well, go consider. If you like. So I think there's always going to be people that will take those positions. I think the crooks of the world, and the famous balaclavaed hooded bank robbers that you see in every country of the world, kind of worked that one out years ago. That if you're going to go around and cover up your face, you're probably going to be less hard to recognise. But I think that moving on from the Big Brother has got something that they want to monitor everybody for, particularly in the West, the ways that facial recognition AI can enhance the security of environment. To say I never feel safer than when I'm in Asian cities and Chinese cities. The prospect of being attacked or pickpocketed or the like on the streets is simply so much lower. And I've become very used to this living in Asia as I do, because culturally it's kind of just not done over there. And as a consequence, society is just different, and there's less shootings and stabbings and a lot less theft and burglary.
Well, I think the new program in the United States is when you check in through immigration, we hand you an AR-15 with at least 30 rounds. And so you should feel pretty safe, I think, walking around the United States in the future.
The logic is impeccable, I'm told.
James, one of the startups we talked about earlier, Reality Engines, is actually actively working on those facial, to be able to detect those kind of scenarios. So they have some interesting research.
That's really interesting. The mass shootings that have been happening in the U.S., the insanity around that, AI being able to detect,
that's exactly,
that someone actually is armed, that's going to a place, those are the things for good that are really, really important. And, to go back to what Oliver was saying, the fact that, I could walk around Beijing and I didn't worry about crime and other things is very different. Now, everyone's got their opinion around data and privacy, etc. But, when you walk around and crime is down because they're able to deter people from doing this in this manner, that's different. And then when you take the coronavirus that's going on right now, if all of a sudden the world can turn quickly because the data is accessible, think about it. Every engineer, every data analytics type person just wants the data. Without that data, they can't get models that are going to be really predictive. So I know this will be controversial, but...
Yeah, and Dean, talking about that specifically, Frost & Sullivan put out a 2030 megatrends report a few months ago, and one of the 12 megatrends was innovating to zero. So zero fatalities, zero illness, zero waste, zero, carbon neutral, zero latency. That was actually one of the items in there. So yeah, I think it's kind of an interesting concept. I mean, it's obviously... a pipe dream, but if you look at it on a micro level, it's certainly something that progress,
I think that's right. And the controversiality, I think one has to be careful with, of course. But taking the coronavirus, if we did learn that a certain individual had contracted the disease and you couldn't get hold of them by telephone, but by enacting the facial recognition systems, you could at least pick up where they are and where they're wandering and find them, that's probably a good thing.
Well, Oliver, we're reaching the end of our hour with you, and want to thank you so much for being here. I wonder if you might have any predictions for 2020 to 2021 that you might want to share with us about China.
Okay, well, my predictions, and I'm an optimist about China. I'm focused on it because I believe it offers great potential for all the reasons we've talked about. But a couple of the predictions that I think are really important are that I think that the current chaotic and rather panicking situation around the coronavirus, I think that we'll see a true big success story in terms of the collaboration of international experts in finding a rapid means of dealing with an otherwise fatal for many people condition. And I think that will force people to stand back and reflect on how that could be applied in other areas. I think we'll see a big leap forward in health collaboration. And I hope that we'll see, perhaps within 2 to 3 months, absolute clarity around a virus that would historically have taken 9 to 12 to 18 months to achieve. So I think that will become something that's widely talked about. And the openness, if indeed that is what it proves to be, that we're seeing with China and the information, and let's hope that is the case, I think that will underpin and enable the phase 2 of the trade talks between the US and China to be progressed positively. Now, I'm sure that with elections taking place as they are at the end of this year in the US, there's other motivations for getting good success in that area, but that's okay. So I'm expecting that the coronavirus will, in 3 months or 4 months' time, be seen as being just a pretty shocking insight into what new conditions can do, but it'll be behind us. I think we'll see a new era of collaboration between the US and China in respect of technology, which will come about and maybe even address the concerns that the Americans have been expressing over very impressive organizations like Huawei by the end of this year. If we can achieve that, then I think in 12 months' time, when we get to December of this year, the world is going to be in a stronger place for the reasons that China has demonstrated perhaps some of the different things to those that people sometimes assume China would do. So those are my two big predictions. On a direct level with Chayora, we're very keen to ensure that this year we see a really exciting step forward with our business. We've got an amazing data center. We've got great investment backing, and we've just announced a great strategic partnership with Telstra, the Australian telco, to enable us to offer co-location services, which is super exciting. I'm expecting that, again, by the end of this next 12 months period, we'll have seen a further step change on our own journey towards being just a little bit of the jigsaw that is the journey that China's making towards digital infrastructure and being one of the world leaders, put it that way.
In your little 300 megawatt data center in Tianjin.
It's all we could afford at the moment, Dean.
Yeah, that's it. Okay. China scale.
Oliver, thank you so much for being on the show. Fascinating discussion, and we wish you the best in 2020 and hope you'll come back and give us an update on how things are going.
I'll definitely do that. James, Brad, it's been a pleasure talking to you. And Dean, as always, great to collaborate on this one. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Pleasure, Oliver.
Thanks.
Thank you, Oliver.